no one is from scratch. That's probably the first thing that I want to make clear. If we're talking about starting an athlete fresh, no one's really fresh, right? Everyone has a different level of experience and exposures to physical challenges, formal sports, even a teen athlete who's young, who doesn't have a lot of wear and tear, like they still have a history with putting food into their bodies, and that can be a positive or a negative thing for them. So if we're talking about developing an athlete from quote unquote scratch, we're really talking about raising a child. And this is not a parenting podcast, and I don't mean it to be one. However, I still think there's some good principles that we could think about from developing an athlete at different age ranges and stages of their own personal development. So let's walk through what, like, quote unquote optimal athletic development could look like for a CrossFit athlete, depending on where they're at in terms of trajectory of their career. And this could be whether they have a little bit of mud on the tires, so to speak, or if we're truly building the ideal CrossFit athlete from scratch. The fitness movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. We offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for coaches and athletes. It's all at one place, zorfitness.com. So for our purposes today, I split this athlete's career, so to speak, into 3 different stages. Stage 1 would be like truly from scratch, where we're talking about a child. 2 would be quote unquote low mileage, right? Where we're talking about someone who's in their teen years. They have maybe up to a few years and maybe almost no exposure at all to strength conditioning, but maybe have a little bit of exposure in formal sporting settings. And the third one I'm calling top speed. This is someone in their mid-competitive career. So relative to their CrossFit career, they're somewhere in the middle part of that trajectory. So the first half of this, when I'm talking about the child or the teen athlete, I kind of want to take a little bit more of the perspective of a parent. And then for the final one, the top speed, right? Someone who's in their sort of mid-competitive career. Then I'm going to turn it more towards the perspective of the athlete, because at that point, that person's an adult. They're responsible for their own performance. So I'll be speaking directly to that person. And for each of these, I think it's important that I am clear that I'm not just thinking about this in terms of like what immediately is going to give this person the performance benefits, because there is a lot of things you could do, and that's not necessarily setting them up for success down the line. So I'm more so thinking about the key building blocks that you would want in someone's program, for lack of a better word, life, frankly, where they can not only have success now and in the immediate future that they're experiencing, but down the line as well. So I think maybe a good example of this would be like, if we have an 11-year-old, would it be ideal for them to weigh and measure all of their food and really closely track all of their nutrition? It's like, if the only thing that you cared about was their immediate success in the future, then I mean, honestly, probably it would have a performance benefit. However, certainly no one's, or maybe not no one, but I don't think most people are recommending that, right? Because you got to think about what is the ripple effect of that for, a preteen tracking their nutrition that closely and obsessing over every little detail like that. Is that going to have a positive impact down the line or a negative one? And I would say, for the most part, that's going to have a net negative impact in that case. So again, in this podcast, I'm thinking about how can we balance having immediate success along with the longevity and having a healthy relationship with exercise and movement as a whole for the athlete that we're talking about. I also think it's important that we understand that we are talking about working with people. And again, for a good chunk of this, we're talking about young boys and girls and teens who we can't treat them like, a black box theory, right? Where basically like, if you control all the inputs that what outcomes you're going to get. Like, that's not the way people work. It's not the way coaching works. If you need a little more clarification on that, I would say go listen to episode 76, where I talked about reactive periodization and sort of my coaching process that I talk about there. And it's understanding that we're working with human beings, and that human beings have way more complicated lives and inputs than we often give respect for. We're just talking about training. Also, I know I'm having a lot of caveats here at the beginning of the conversation, but I think it's important. Also, this theoretical question that I'm kind of answering is like how to develop an athlete from scratch. Like, that's assuming that this kid or this a young person wants to keep the same goal across their entire upbringing, which it happens, but that's extremely rare. Like, say there's an athlete and they're 14 years old now, and they say, hey, I want to be a games athlete. And as a parent, you're super gung ho about that. I think it's easy to assume that they're going to keep those goals indefinitely. And what you don't realize is that, okay, 6, 8, 10 years down the road, if they are sticking with that goal, it means training, 14 sessions a week, forfeiting their professional career, giving up certain, social engagements, and all of that with the hope of one day making to the games when they're, 24 or 25 years old. It's like at some point you have to reconcile that a lot of those people are going to drop off along the way, and that's an okay and totally fine thing, and people just change their goals, and especially kids, they want to go after something different, and that's okay, and you have to be allowing a kid to do that. Like, it can't be your thing, it has to be their thing. And therefore I would say that you just need to focus on developing a strong, resilient human being from a very broad perspective that encompasses their minds, their emotions, and their physical self, and not neglecting any of those areas or hyper focusing on one specific thing. So with all those caveats out of the way, let's dive into it. So if we're starting an athlete from scratch, where this is like a child that we're working with, I would say the priority when you're working with a kid, and again, for most people, I'm talking about raising their own kids. This is like, if you're raising up a little human being, really the goal there is for you to instill in them the values and the belief systems that your family holds as incredibly important. And I would say this is primarily through observing and mirroring what the parents are doing, and less through like formal, like quote unquote teaching. So for me, I'm a dad. I have a 1.5-year-old son as of the recording of this. And for someone like him, how do I instill the value of like hard work, consistency, or quality time, things like that? I would say it's probably not through like telling him that he like needs to work hard or something like that. Like, that seems like really obvious to people who are parents. I would say it's learned through witnessing his mother and I doing things like, getting up at the same time every day, investing in our physical health with exercise, enjoying time outdoors as a family, and doing things that involve our bodies that are outside of exercise, like just going for a walk or enjoying nature, things like that. Having real food to eat the same times every day, like those things instill consistency, instill work ethic, instill the importance of quality time, like all of those values and things that we want our son to have. Those are learned through him seeing those things being represented. And here, really, it's about like a more mature, centered, consistent adult will raise a child with those same qualities. And that is by no means rocket science, but it's also a super challenging thing to do when you have that responsibility as a parent. So I'd say part one is being a role model in the very true sense of the word. And then part two is spending quality time with them and just having fun and doing things that even within that are still challenging. Right. So there can be this sense of like problem solving and discovery, even when things aren't necessarily intrinsically fun. Right. And I think you have to balance both of those, doing things that are fun in the moment that can be, again, quality time type things, like, throwing ball in the yard and doing all that kind of stuff. Like, my son loves to be in his backpack as we go on walks and stuff. Like, those things are intrinsically fun. That's super important. You can also teach that, hey, this thing that is challenging can also be fun because it provides a unique sense of accomplishment when we do that sort of thing. He might be a little on the young side for that, but certainly something that I would start to think about as you're raising a son or a daughter. So again, if we're actually talking about like the physical training, I know don't want to get too far off of this. What does it look like for like a 1.5-year-old? Like, it looks like if I'm working out, I pick things that are not going to be super time intensive where I don't get to spend time with him, right? I'm doing either like strength work or skill work where there's built-in rest time so that I can interact and have fun with him, and I am spending quality time with him. And that way it allows me to be more present, and I'm more okay with stopping what I'm doing and giving time and attention to my son. So that's one thing. And then he can, observe what I'm doing at this point. And sometimes it'll be, kind of copying and mirroring what I'm doing, even down to like the noises and everything, like grunting and picking up PVC pipes and all that kind of fun stuff. Or it could just be like playing over in the crash pads or doodling on the whiteboard, doing like that kind of stuff. And I would say that's one aspect of it, right? And that, again, that is very much so play. But other times it's literally just like we're hanging out in the yard and he goes over to the garage door, starts banging on the door. He wants into the garage because he wants to be able to play more. And that's an important thing to protect and preserve, I think, and allowing him to, again, just kind of do whatever he wants when he actually gets in there. And maybe I show him some things. Maybe it's just like playing. Maybe it's just cheering him on if he, is trying to lift a tiny little dumbbell or something like that, right? Just having fun with it. No different than if we were out playing ball in the yard, right? No different than that. There's no real agenda. There's no thing that I'm trying to push on him. It's just like, hey, let's have fun and move. And oh, by the way, I just happen to have some of this exercise equipment here, right? I would definitely not think about it as any more formal than that. Now, that's obviously extremely young, like pretty much from scratch. Coach Chris has some kiddos of his own, and they're a little bit older. He's a son and a daughter, so I called him up, and this is what he has to say about like what quote unquote exercise looks like nowadays.
Calling Chris Hardenberg. Hello?
What's up, dude?
Not much. What's going on?
I have you on recording right now.
Okay.
So I'm gonna throw this into a podcast.
Okay. Let's make it happen.
So, how old is Sayla and Riley?
So Riley's 8 and Sayla's 5.
Okay, and like, well, I don't need to put any caveats on it. Like, just explain like kind of what you do with them, exercise wise.
So like I take probably three times a week generally when we're in a rhythm, right? We'll do a morning workout. So that'll be 5 minutes long. We usually rotate who picks the movement. So like one day I might say, all right, Riley, pick what we're doing today. Sayla, you pick what we're doing today. I'll pick what we're doing the next day. And this is after me doing it like multiple times because now they'll have a little bit of a Rolodex of like things like, oh, all right, I want to do a wall. I want to do burpees. I want to do push-ups.
Yeah.
And then outside of that, it might be like, general play. Right now we play a game pretty frequently called ball off the roof. So like it's like big balls, and I punch them off the roof. They kind of bounce off the roof, and the kids have to run and try to catch it. And it's super simple, but I was like, it's funny to think about the other day. I was like, that's actually like really good for like in terms of like trying to track an object, your eye, where is it going to land? I need to put my body to try to catch it, almost like an outfielder would in baseball. And then Riley's at the age at 8 that does some organized sports. So like last year, played flag football, track. So we kind of have a mix of everything. And then just there's also like for you, right, Jackson, like it's almost like fitness through osmosis, right? Like they
Yep.
watch the things that they try to repeat it.
Yeah. Doesn't everybody have barbells in their garage?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's kind of cool to like they kind of get it through osmosis a little bit that way.
Yeah. Totally. Well, thanks. I appreciate you giving us a little bit of insight.
Yeah, man, that was it. That's all you need.
That was it. That was the only reason I needed to call you.
That's easy. I'm glad I could.
Thanks, man. I'll see you. So now let's go to a teen athlete, someone who's low mileage, right? Pretty low training age. In my mind, the ideal development for an athlete like this would be picking, a small number of sports. You don't have to go crazy, but like this is ideally probably selected by them, and they're taking ownership in their development of their own abilities, right? And ideally, this would be something that is kind of cyclical in nature throughout the year, where they're not doing the same thing the entire year. They're not trying to overdo it, where they're playing, multiple sports at the same time, right? Just letting them be a kid and like go through like the natural seasons that are going to pop up with like, school and sports and like that sort of thing. I think it's very healthy and a natural progression to go through, and giving them as much ownership in that process while encouraging them is probably sort of a sweet spot, I think, in my mind. Don't specialize, don't get super specific, and let the kid probably make the most of the decisions while the parent is sort of like the guardrails, right? Like keep their hand off a hot stove, making sure that you're there when they need you. And if they're asking for help, certainly you can provide that, but trying to have them take as much ownership for the whole thing as you possibly can is only going to set them up for success down the road. And then athletically, I would say it's your job to ensure that since you're taking your hands off the reins a little bit, is to ensure that the adults that are working with them know what they're doing, and that will help allow your kid to take more ownership and for you to feel like you can back off a little bit more if you've actually vetted who those people are. Now, I would say, if possible, I would recommend the same thing for strength conditioning or CrossFit in this case. If your kid wants to do CrossFit, basically get someone else who knows what they're doing to coach your kid. But again, it's your responsibility to make sure that that person knows what they're doing, that you've actually vetted them. And just so that we're not all talking about theory here, I want to give a little bit of practical exercise advice for if we're talking about, like, let's call it like a teenager, someone who's like post puberty, let's call it, I think would be a good recommendation here. And maybe even before that, I would say these are still good recommendations to follow. Would be following the fundamental movement patterns and learning those well, getting confident in those, having sound movement, and working on unfatigued strength. I think the MCIs of that CrossFit preaches is a great principle to abide by. Mechanics, consistency, then intensity. If you follow that model, that's a really good place to start. So what are the fundamental movement patterns? Push, pull, squat, hinge, right? Running, lunging, bounding, all those types of movements, even rotational movements you could throw in there, all the basic stuff that all humans and kids should be able to do. So that's one, is the fundamental movement patterns. Two is skills, things like the Olympic lifts, right? Where it's not just a very simple fundamental movement pattern, things that are a little bit complicated. There's a lot more moving pieces. You don't need to load those crazy heavy. You don't need to, again, have them doing sport CrossFit movements right away, like, kipping ring muscle ups and handstand walking, all the crazy stuff. You don't need to do that right away. Even if your kid wants to do CrossFit, if you set them up with the fundamentals really well and teach them how to do things like hold a static handstand hold and things like the basics of those sports, that's going to have incredible carryover to if they do want to get more specific and more competitive, frankly, down the road. And that's also going to set them up for success from like a joint health perspective and hormone profile, all the above. So skills, things like Olympic lifts, gymnastics fundamentals, and I say that because I don't think of the gymnastics typically that we see in CrossFit are the fundamentals. More things like creating shapes, being able to have core extremity type movements. That's more of like the basics that I'm thinking about. And then three would be conditioning. And for conditioning, again, I don't think kids need to be doing hard energy systems training, but I think some basic body weight type movements and cyclical work, and you could even combine those two, right? And making it fun and different every single time, and providing kids with a unique challenge, like a very basic CrossFit Metcon that you would do in like an intro on ramp type class would probably be okay for a lot of teens. And then I would say ideally something like that in this third conditioning bucket, if you could throw a capacity based sport in there as well, that would be great. I think team sports are super important, and strategy based sports. However, if you can have a racing sport in there as well, like swimming, cross country, track and field, anything like that would be super helpful as well to get a little exposure of how to think about pacing and developing energy systems in a way that it's also like on a team with other people, with a coach other than the person's parent. Like all those things are helpful settings there. Two more tidbits that I'd probably add to that would be one, biasing eccentric movements and isometric contractions. Eccentrics, in other words, like the lowering phase of movements, right? So doing like tempo squats, something as simple as like a tempo goblet squat is a great way to learn how to squat with some external load in a way that's a whole lot more controlled and is going to carry over really well to other types of heavier squatting down the line. So biasing the lowering portion of movements, doing things like isometrics, right? And it's something as simple as a handstand hold against a wall, a high plank hold, figuring out how to hang from a pull-up bar or to do a chin over bar hang or a ring row, like holding at your chest, right? Like all those types of isometrics are going to be great options and stuff that is going to have very little joint stress, very little wear and tear, and have the biggest impact positively on motor control, which is something that teens are going to be working a lot to develop. They lack motor control because they just haven't been doing those movements for a decade plus, right? They have a very low training age. So developing that motor control is going to be super important. And then that's the one thing, biasing the eccentrics and isometrics, those contractions. And then I would say also just understanding that the learning that takes place is actually probably more important than like the quote unquote training. Thinking more about developing an athlete's skills and toolbox and awareness of how they're moving, and developing the way that they think about their own technique. All of those sort of soft skills are probably more important than like training in terms of like creating like really strong like adaptations, right? So always thinking about having our work be form focused and doing like more like quote unquote like drilling versus like testing. So more things that are just like, hey, let's practice this and try to refine it, make it as pretty as we possibly can, versus like, let's go really hard with this, let's go fast, right? The language that you use in those settings is going to be very different when you're having different outcomes like that. Do you have a topic that you'd like to request as a future show, or just a question about training? Reach out to me. My email is ben@zorfitness.com, or you can DM me on Instagram @zorfitness. Lastly, head over to zorfitness.com if you want to browse all of our previous shows with in-depth show notes, as well as educational content for all things training. And finally, let's talk about top speed, right? So this is someone who's sort of in the middle of their competitive career as a CrossFit athlete. And here I'm kind of taking a hard shift. This is someone who's in CrossFit. They're competitive. They've been doing it for a number of years. They are not fresh at this. They're someone who they've taken care of a lot of the low-hanging fruit that they know of, right? So if there's easy adaptation to be had, they've sort of done it already, right? And they're at an inflection point. This is someone who's invested multiple years into their performance and takes their fitness more seriously. And because of that, when they reach a plateau or they're kind of, leveling off in that direction, that the way that you go about attacking it has to be a little bit different, right? So I would say if this is you or you think you're headed in that direction, one of the most important, probably the most important thing that you can do is to enlist outside help, right? Someone who can help you find more low-hanging fruit, right? That low-hanging fruit for you at this point, you've taken care of all the stuff that you know of. So it is in your blind spot. And then people are like, where's my blind spot? It's like, well, you don't know, right? That's the one thing that we do know, is that you don't know. So for you, it could be like your low-hanging fruit might be the fact that you could be doing, you're actually doing too many metcons. And if you did less, that would help you get to the competitive strength levels in some of your absolute numbers. It might mean that you're doing for the first time some tailored progressions that can help you develop the proficiency in your high-level gymnastics to compete at the level that you want to. It might mean committing to a higher level in terms of like the amount of time that you're actually willing to give to the thing, and potentially like splitting sessions, right? So rather than having 1 3-hour PM block, you split that into an AM and a PM, where you have 2 90-minute blocks. And even though you're doing the same amount of total work, the quality of each of those sessions goes up because you're not super fatigued in the second half, and therefore you actually continue to improve for longer. It could be, maybe you don't actually plan out your seasons. It could be sitting down and planning out with someone else times where you're going to be pushing volume and doing more total work. There's other times where you're going to pull that back and intensify all the work that you're doing so that you can express higher on your actual testing when you go to do that. And understanding that there's times to take off seasons and there's other times to push. All those little things, again, if it was stuff that you knew how to do already at this point in your career, you would have already taken care of it. So the point is, you don't know and you can't see because it's in your blind spot. So again, if that's you, you have to be diligent enough to enlist the help of someone and get someone's help who can be in your corner for you, so to speak. Even if it's not a remote coach, even if it's not me, get somebody in your corner who can help you out. And really, that's my final advice for building the ideal CrossFit athlete from scratch. Thanks for listening today. If you're someone who just started listening to the show, I would encourage you to subscribe so you can stay up to date. If you're someone who's been listening for a while, I would encourage you to rate and review the show. And lastly, the best thing that you can do to support our work is also the best thing that you can do for your performance. And that is by hiring one of our coaches. Until next time, stay the course.